Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you join us today for a very important back to basics session on how to build a data culture in an organization. I'm Monica Khurana, MMA India Country Head, and your host for today. But before we dive into it, let me share a little about MMA with you. MMA is a not for profit global trade body which brings the ecosystem together and has heightened focus on modern marketing. We are a growing chapter in India and have had footprints here for over 10 years. MMA's mission is to enable marketers to drive innovation, enduring business value, stronger consumer engagement in an increasingly dynamic and connected world. So, how do we do this? We enable ongoing education through reports, white papers, training programs. We develop several impact studies and research on effectiveness. We set standards and guidelines, and we inspire the industry with several use cases and awards platforms. Our programs are designed to drive learning, assessments, networking, research, and capability building. We have think tanks and working groups across the globe, and we enable several networking opportunities. We are proud to share with you our growing AMP community, which is continuously working at accelerating modern marketing practices. These councils represent the ecosystem and drive education, thought leadership, build standards in various aspects of modern marketing, be it MarTech, e-commerce, voice, brand safety, and others. A big shout out to our MarTech Council, who's working closely with us on the MarTech narrative to enable pioneering marketers to better understand the dynamically evolving nature of modern marketing. The MarTech Council seeks to help in building MarTech blueprints, utilizing stacks effectively, creating maturity frameworks, and enabling thought leadership. We are also coming up with a playbook, which is a guide for modern marketers on MarTech maturity. It helps you understand selection of right MarTech stacks, the ecosystem, and also several case studies on how industry has embraced MarTech stacks. Today, the session will throw light on what is data culture and why is it important. How do organizations build success through a data culture, and how do they get value from the investments made in data? Before I start, I do want to share with you some quick housekeeping rules. Make sure that you ask all your questions in the question and answer toolbar provided on the dashboard. Do address the respective speaker you want an answer from. Do make sure the questions are restricted only to the webinar. Having said that, I'm delighted to invite all our speakers and experts who are gathered here and have been kind enough to make time to share their journey in creating data culture. So let's begin with listening to what ZAVED says. ZAVED, who's VP Digital Transformation and Growth, Unilever South Asia, he wears several hats at Levers, which include strategic planning, innovation, management, and business growth. He leads something extremely exciting, which is called Reimagine HUL, which is a marquee digital transformation program for Levers. So let's hear from Zaved. Over to you, Zaved.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. Wonderful to be here. Let me just pull up. I hope you're able to see.
Yes.
My screen. Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody is at home and safe. So today we're going to talk about around building a data culture. And I'll try to talk about our experiences on this journey over the last few years in this space. So firstly, before really jumping into this whole space on data culture, which is quite heavy, I think the first thing I want to talk about is this whole thing of finding data and the use of data. And an important element of this one is a lot of time we spend time and effort to really find data, but not necessarily leverage and use them. And I think usage is probably the most important factor, because unless we're really able to really use the data, it essentially would mean that we will actually be of no use of this money that we spend behind really collecting those data. Hence, unless we don't know what to do with it, it will absolutely be useless for us to drive this. And let me try to give you an example. And this example is from a context of data from a value to valuation of data. Because everybody says there's a value to data, but I personally believe that it's important to really make sure that we're able to improve the valuation of data, because that is when it actually starts making sense. And then let me try to attempt to explain what I mean by that.
Zaved, I think we can't see the screen if you're trying to share something. I think we're not able to see now.
Okay, I thought I was sharing the screen. Sorry, I just realized there was a bit of delay. So as I was perfect now, right? As I was saying, I was talking about the value of data. And the important element of this one was about saying, how do you really look at data and see it from a valuation perspective? And that's where the whole conversation is around that. How do you really build that valuation? Now, there's lots of data across the organization, whether it is usership data, whether it is P&L data, whether it is financial data, or even our operational data. I think the question at the end of the day, how do you really use this data? Now, when you actually start looking at this data, you can start putting them together, and then you know that you're able to really look at data and put this in. So you figured out that I'm losing market share. But even now, it is just an information. It is of very little use unless you're able to figure out what the reason is. And that goes into what I call knowledge, because we may be losing market share because there is an erosion in brand equity, or there is the fact that I have not really put my communication on air for long enough time, or the fact that my product maybe actually has some issues and hence I'm losing share. But still, this is still a knowledge for me. But unless we're able to really stitch this diverse set of data and really make sense out of it, and unless we're able to really do that, we can't really figure out how all of this actually works. And when data actually becomes insight is when it actually starts making a lot of sense. And that's the most important element of it. And a lot of times we say data is a fuel, but I think at the end of the day, when we actually turn them into insight is when the gasoline happens. And let me try to give you an example. As COVID, and unfortunately, we see the second wave coming in as well. We've seen how people have all retreated home and really distant from each other. And the whole idea was, how do you really look at mobility data, look at people data, and figure out that how do you really create brand connectivity? Because we realized that because people were home, detergents were not being used as frequently and used as many times. And we really try to connect the data and figure out how do you really create communication that actually enables you to connect. And the next communication is exactly an example of where data that was analyzed, disparate data, put into an insight to deliver a communication. So the next one is a communication that we land in recently during Holi itself. Many of you might have seen, but I just want to say that the communication just didn't happen. The back end was a lot of data that went in making it.
दीदी रंजू कहाँ है? वो नहीं खेल सकता. नो रंजू.
पार्सल आया होगा, जरा ग्लव्स पहन लेना.
मेरी मुट्ठी में रंग जितने उतने रंग कहाँ, ज़मीं गर कम पड़े.
मेरे हाथ नहीं पहुँचेंगे, इसलिए मैंने रंग पहुँचा दिए.
तो मैं रंग दूँ आसमां.
थोड़ी हेल्प करो ना रंजू.
रंग दे रंग दे रंग दे रंग दे आसमां.
जो दिलों को पास लाए वो रंग अच्छे हैं. सर्फ एक्सेल, दाग अच्छे हैं.
For a brand that was actually at a challenge situation, we've actually leveraged data to really create communication that enables to drive usership up. Now, in terms of building many of this, and I wanted to give an example and then come back into the whole space of building a culture. And what I say is, in order to build a culture, what is important is data needs to be at the heart of the organization strategy. It just can't be at the periphery of the organization. And when you look at the data, you need to really look at data as an enterprise asset. And I'll come and talk about a bit on enterprise assets, because the reality is data tend to sit in different silos in the organization, and we are not really able to really leverage and use them in tandem. The third one is actually really make sure there is a representation at leadership, because you must put the impetus behind driving data and making sure that people understand the importance. And that is where also comes the thought leadership of data integrity and ethics, because unless you really put this into leadership, you won't be able to drive it. And to really embed these themes, there are 4 specific things that we have done as an organization. One is obviously the whole figuring out the organization, a bit on business impact, people, how people enable data, and I'll talk about technology and infrastructure. So let me start with the first one, data across the organization. So when we started this journey a few years back, we realized that as an organization, we had a lot of data, but the data were sitting in different silos. It was amazing to discover how they were in different places. And what is important was, how do you really break the silos and interconnect data? In fact, you realize that even within function, data was in silos. And we need to really start looking at data as your ecosystem. You really need to look at how data can be interconnected. And the challenge is, reality is that we've got some retail data, some consumer data, some mind measured data, and they're in disparate format. How do you really make those data talk to each other? And that is really, really important to really break the silos. Second one, running down to this part, is about how do you really leverage data to figure out the business impact? And here, what is important is to really figure out what the business need. Why do you really need the data, and how are you going to use it? And contextualize from the external data environment. For example, a cookieless world, how are you going to operate it, for example, being one of them. Then really define the need and relevance of the data, figure out how you're going to use it. And then obviously we realize, we know how to capture, analyze, and leverage loop of really how do you really use the data. But underneath each of these elements, there's the important element that we need to understand. One is this whole space of how do you really figure out the value exchange of data when you're capturing. It is such an important element. And connected to that is the progressive profiling, because we realize that that will really be critical for unlocking and managing them. Second is, in terms of analyzing, you really need to figure out the brand basket, figure out the consumer journey. And the biggest question that we're trying to understand is, how do you integrate the upper funnel and lower funnel? Because that is where the value lies for an organization itself. And then finally, it's important to really enrich the data and figure out how people give brilliant end-to-end consumer experience. Collectively, when this whole thing starts working, you really start seeing a business impact on this. And finally, the third one is all around people. And a lot of people talk about that you probably need data scientists only. But it's not about that. It is about the ability for people to understand the business problem. Connected to that is the collaboration of data scientists as well as business. Because when that happens, that's the sweet spot of really leveraging advanced analytics and bringing business impact. Because that is when you create an organization of data-savvy people. Because that is when you really leverage and use data. And fourth, and the final one, which is the important one, is how do we create the tech infrastructure at the back end? And here's the schematic of how we look at it. I spoke about enterprise data, because right now, what we need to really look at the consumer data lake that we have, an environment where all the consumer data that we measured are there. The customer data is where we actually, as we wire up different kinds of data, how we connect them. The third one is the supply chain. So there's a lot of operations data about process optimization, maintenance data, forecasting, modeling, and the ability to really connect all this data and overlay with the external data ecosystem that comes in. Because what you realize is there's a huge and potent external data ecosystem that enables us to really overlay on our internal data to really create a competitive advantage for us. And that is when we really, really unleash the data culture in the organization. So in some organization, really set up an interconnected organization enabling to unleash the silos in it, create for business impact, people that understand problem, and then obviously the right kind of infrastructure that enables you to really leverage all of this. And I like this quote from Jack Welch, which is my parting quote, is really the role of data, because this is how we can really make data actually have a competitive advantage of how we really run business. Yeah. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to all of you.
Hey, Zaved, that was absolutely insightful and very crisply articulated. Thank you so much for doing this. I think you mentioned some very, very valuable points there. I did hear you talk about data is at the heart of the organization strategy. Data is what is not represented just at the team level, but at the leadership level. And that's how it sort of enables the culturing in the organization. And that's extremely valuable. Couldn't agree more. Thank you so much. Up next, we have Girish Vardarajan, who's the head analytics Aditya Birla Capital. Girish has 20 plus years of experience in analytics and technology. He has worked across multiple sectors like IT, telecom, DTH, and BFSI. He takes great interest, he says, in ancient history and astronomy. Those sound quite unique. So Girish, over to you to tell us a little about how you practice data culture at ABG.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Monica, and a good afternoon to all of you. Let me put up my presentation and I'll walk you through what I feel, is how an organization ends up building data culture. And it's a bare bones, as Monica started in the introduction, a back to basics approach to how a data culture can be built in the organization. Now, when you look at different definitions of the term culture, this is the definition that I like the best, which is to say culture is nothing but a way of life. And now if we have to look at data culture, so what if this is culture, what is data culture? So in my dictionary, data culture means using data to take business decisions and make that a way of life. It's not something that has to be reminded. It's something that becomes intuitive and natural for a business manager to do. So when we reach that Zen level is when we say that we've established a data culture in an organization. And as a practitioner, I've seen this across different verticals and different organizations within a vertical. And here are my thoughts around how we can go about building a data culture. So in my perspective, data culture, people tend to focus more on the data side of it rather than the culture side of it. But the culture part of it is actually the really difficult part. I mean, that's the part that's the toughest to crack. The data part of it, I will touch upon it. They are enablers, but it's beyond, creating a central data warehouse and creating analytical models. And then there's this whole thing about, democratization of data and having self-service interactive dashboards and so on, so that end users can start playing around with data. But it's beyond all of that. I mean, before we hit this part of it, I think there's something else that we need to evaluate first within an organization as to where we are from a data culture point of view. How far are we from what is referred to as data culture? So it's, like I said, less about data and more about the culture. And when I say that, I basically mean it's about changing an employee's DNA. Now, there are different types of organizations at different levels of vintage and maturity. You have startups where you start off the block with a new set of employees, and you have the luxury of hiring the new age, employees with the new age DNA embedded in them. And then you have larger organizations, vintage organizations with pedigree, where it's a lot about changing the existing DNA of the employee stack. So how do we go about that? And these are some of my thoughts in terms of how we have succeeded in doing this. The first thing is actually to listen to what people say amongst the employees in terms of myths versus realities. What I found is most managers believe that they make data-driven decisions. You ask them and they say, yeah, we look at data and then we take a call. But more often than not, they make gut calls. It's just that data tends to flow through their fingers and hands, and they believe that that is data-driven decision making. But more often than not, it's to do with gut. And there are a few of them who believe that data has no role to play in their line of work. Typically, and some of you would appreciate what I'm saying, is, let's say, for example, in a creative line of work, right? So people would come up and say, what does data got to do in my life? My line of work is completely creative in nature. And there are others who would, typically say that, yeah, there's a lot of data, but you know what? A lot of data is, most of it is either garbage, it's got junk data, it's of little use. it's data that was that is reflecting the reality of the 20th century, and that's got nothing to do with ground realities and so on. So there are a lot of these uh, you know verbatims that you will get from your employees when you actually go about trying to figure out how deep are we in the data culture and the culture part of the data culture. So how do you deal with this? How do you deal with managers? And that doesn't necessarily mean they're the middle management. There's this kind of verbatim you'll even hear from the senior management. So how do you go about tackling this situation? So the way we were looking at it is, the question is, should it be driven top down from the CEO downwards, or should it be bottom up? Should we start at the bottom and then build it upwards? The answer is actually, at least in my opinion, both. We got to look at it top down as well as bottom up. Now let's look at it from a top down perspective. Why is it required to be top down? That's because the C-suite, starting with the CEO, with the CXOs of the organization, must believe that the organization's data is a strategic asset. So we heard ZAVED referring to it as an enterprise asset. This is exactly the point that I am also trying to drive. It has to be strategic in nature and not a tactical asset that is used just for operational purposes, but it's a strategic asset which can give the organization a competitive advantage, and we can actually get the best of a customer's lifetime value if we use data. I think if that mindset is not there in the C-suite, then we have, there is a issue on the cultural front. The other 2 points are kind of related, and it's very important. I've seen this work beautifully in the organizations where I've worked, and I've seen data. And as the head of analytics in multiple organizations, I've seen this work really well. Is to set examples when we have reviews or we have discussions, even if it's a discussion across the table, and a decisioning a point of a situation comes up. It's the responsibility of the C-suite and the senior management to ensure or to give the rest of the organization the clear kind of I wouldn't say diktat, but a clear kind of a cultural direction, saying that decisions will not be taken if they're not backed with data. I think that's really important. And if the rest of the organization sees this happening repeatedly, it kind of spreads, it breeds. At the same time, having said that, will just top-down work? I don't believe that's true. It is also important to build the culture bottom-up. And what happens typically, and as a practitioner, I'm saying this, when we try to implement data-driven or digital projects in the organization, you'll always hear from the employees, what no one asked me about it. There's no input that has come from my end. I know exactly what happens on ground. This is just stuff that is being built at the top, and it's being thrust down our throats. So the best way to beat that is actually to involve the employees at the execution level in as many data projects as possible. It's very important to get their buy-in. In fact, if you go around talking to the ground level employees, you'll find that one person who will actually be the biggest detractor. Get that person to really get that person's buy-in, and you'll find that when that person turns into the loudest evangelist, that's when it really goes viral, and the entire department then buys into the concept. So you will hear these kind of terms coming in. Hey, you know what? And I'm literally paraphrasing what I heard once. Wo mera model hai. That's my model. That's my predictive model. Those are my variables that went in. So I'll give you a quick example of how, when we built a predictive model in one of our lines of businesses, typically those of you who are in the line of building predictive models will find that 7 to 8 variables that are significant. The rest of the variables don't do much in improving the accuracy. But in this case, I actually added 20 variables. Why? When I put up the 8 variables, the rest of the on-ground employees said, hey, you know what? Where are my variables? I contributed some 3 variables. I told you guys that will be important, but I don't see it in the output. Adding those variables just changed the accuracies by a few basis points, but what the hell? I mean, it was much more important for me to get the buy-in of those people to use the model, and to make it a part of their operational culture than to haggle about, should I add this data variable, what value is it going to add, is there any information value in it, and so on. That it's that aspect that has to be brought in, that softer aspect that has to be brought in, at least in the initial introduction of data culture in the organization, to involve people, get their involvement, get their inputs well entrenched or well embedded into the output. It's only then that we'll see that culture spreading. And like I said, that the culture, this is the culture part of it. And then the data part of it is what I refer to as enablers. And the number one enabler, again, which is kind of counterintuitive to what you'd expect from an analytics guy to say, is to set the right organization structure. So for starters, we need to have a dedicated team to work on data. This team cannot be a team that is doing other work, let's say in IT, and is also working on data, is not doing some work in some digital stream and is also working on data. It has to be a dedicated team. It's my firm conviction that that's the way it's supposed to be. And the second point is equally important, which is to say that this team of, let's say, data engineers and data scientists can't be sitting in isolation. And that's a clear way of killing the whole culture. They have to be embedded within the business operations. They have to be involved in the business operations. The business folks should see these guys getting and gals getting involved in their daily lives and taking their inputs. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. Then there's a technology which has got two aspects which I thought are very important. Some of it, as ZAVED very beautifully depicted in his diagrams, which is basically to eliminate data silos and to bring all the data into one repository. And the longer the vintage of an organization, the more the data silos. Both ZAVED and I work in really vintage organizations, and we understand the importance of this statement. And also on data squatting, this is a terminology that I like to refer to, which is basically people who hoard. They're other squatters or hoarders. They hoard data and they know that they have this data, but they won't share it. You got to find those, as again, I'm referring again to ZAVED's presentation, which is that small data. There are those really small, unique data points that some people will be sitting on, which you have to extract, like a pearl from an oyster, and get it into the data repository. It's those pearls that are also important. It's not just the big data that has to be brought into the repository. And the second aspect, which I find is very important, is to have a single version of the truth. So for example, in telecom, you would have different departments having different ways to measure ARPU or average revenue per user, or different metrics for churn, and different metrics for any operational metric that you can talk about. The finance department will have a different definition, whereas the operations team would have a different definition, and the sales team would have a completely different definition. That has to be standardized. I think everybody should talk about the same metric with the same definitions across all departments. I think that then there's a lot of conflict resolution that happens with this. And then there's a lot of focus, there's a lot of commonalization of focus that happens from a cultural point of view also in the organization. The third and the last point that I put up was talent. Now, talent, it's not just the second point, which is hiring new employees with the right kind of DNA, and they would fit into a data culture, on day one. But it's also very important. It's something that we've done very well in ABG, which is to have programs, which is have specific programs to expose our existing employees to the benefits of data and analytics. So it could be starting with completely people who are not exposed to data and the analytics side of it, to have introductory programs, and then to have 3 to 4 levels in terms of the technical detailing of these programs to cater to different segments of employees, and then move them through the curve, move them through the learning curve, so that there is a entire appreciation also that, hey, what, data can do this for us, which kind of starts kicking in. And then when the data team starts talking to them, their involvement and their contribution also is much more deeper and much more richer than coming in completely cold. So I think organization structure, the technology and talent, these, I mean, it spells OTT in today's world, but yeah, that's my OTT, for driving a data culture. And I thought these are the kind of thoughts that I had when I was asked, how do you see data culture being driven across organizations that I've worked in across different verticals. And this is what works in telecom, be it BFSI. I've seen this a common thread running right through different verticals. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Fabulous. OTT, I just like that. It really summed it up. It's an acronym which I'm sure everybody listening in is going to remember to apply. I totally felt like I was in a classroom. I was listening very attentively. I think there was a lot of words of wisdom there. Completely agree. It is about making it in the making data the DNA of employees and really doing it across the ecosystem, be it in terms of the org structure, the talent, the technology, and involving data experts, in every business decision versus making them work like a silo. I think those were really valuable insights. Thank you, Girish. Totally appreciate it. We'll have you back for the panel discussion. And now next up is my favorite brand, no bias to others, but Chumbak it is. And we have Vivek Prabhakar, who's the co-founder at Chumbak. Vivek is the founding member of Chumbak. He's worked in marketing and product-led roles in the past, be it in the consumer goods category, telecom category, IT category. He totally enjoys photography, traveling, growing his own microgreens, and spending time with family. So with all these elements of skill to him, I think he's been able to add a lot of value to the portfolio of Chumbak as well. So let's hear from Vivek what he has to say about data culture. Vivek, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. So I'm going to make it a little, how do I say, step back in terms of, the basics in terms of what we've learned. And while I've got ZAVED and Girish going on and telling us what in growth stages and legacy larger companies can do, I think I'm here to add a little bit in terms of what at a startup level, what have we learned and trying to build. And I use the word trying because it's an ongoing process in that sense. So I think without further ado, here are 8 things that we've learned trying to build a data culture at Chumbak. I think one of the first things is obvious enough in saying that data is everywhere you look for it. And, while we have the traditional points of sale, you have loyalty programs, you have customer journeys, customer behavior, both offline and online. We have external data coming in from marketing. We have brand data. We have research data. We have product data. I think one of the biggest things that we've learned at Chumbak is that look for data which is unique to you as well. So for example, a lot of the data that we look at is product related as well as design related. We're able to look into data and say that, listen, one of the things that we've learned over the past decade with Chumbak is the color purple on a product doesn't work. And through years of understanding what kind of design, what kind of product it goes on, purple randomly just doesn't seem to work in this country. Coming to the next one, get the basics right. And I think here it's so important. And I'm going to talk about 2 parts of it. One is, I think, the people. And, it starts from actually setting the context when you're even hiring and interviewing people and getting people into the company. One of the things that when we speak to anybody that we hire at Chumbak is clearly upfront told, listen, while, a whole bunch of trial and error happens and a whole bunch of hypothesis comes, data is like the only thing that we look at. And we have mountains and mountains of data. It's extremely important to get that going. Having said that, still, as Girish said, we face the same typical problem of data silos are used to till we killed access to a whole bunch of people. We have data squatting or hoarding for sure. And, one of the things that we've realized is that each team, while it works, in silos and independently, but at the same time is dependent on other kind of departments for data. It works when, the kind of culture that's going through the company is of sharing data and saying that, hey, listen, we have one goal. Eventually, goal may be revenue, but, there are various what I call mini goals that we get to before getting to the main revenue kind of goal. The other thing that we spend time on is technology, right? I think every company in the world today is a tech company, if they like it or not. and even we are like a consumer goods company in that sense, goods or product company in that sense, but tech is just the sheer backbone of this company. Any decision that we've taken, from opening our stores. So for example, I'll give you random decisions. So we had to open a store in Bhubaneswar, and we looked at data. There were 4 big places in Bhubaneswar that could be potential stores. We looked at e-commerce data. We looked at external data of where traffic was. We looked at other kind of brands. And put in some 18 or 19 different sources that come into one thing and saying that, hey, pinpointing, these are the kind of places within this kind of 2-kilometer range is where you open a kind of store. So I think that using technology is like the most important thing that we've kind of learned at Chumbak, which segues into the next point, which is like literally over-invest in technology, right? And here what we've realized is that really early on, we figured that, when we didn't have our own stores and we were selling through other mom and pop stores across the country, we had chumbak.com, we had marketplaces and all of that. There would be, for example, if ZAVED was shopping, there would be a ZAVED chumbak.com, there would be a ZAVED, say, Amazon or Flipkart, and there would be a ZAVED someone else who bought at a store. And, we were getting 3 different types of, consumer journeys, but the person is the same. So I think investing and over-investing in technology is that we've learned is a good thing. A lot of people will come back and say, hey, listen, we'll scale as it happens and we'll figure out, we'll keep adding on, we'll do it and all. But one of the things that's actually held us in like great amount of strength through this entire thing is the tech backbone has been, for suppose if you're doing 100 rupees of sale today, we build a tech backbone that's enough for a 1,000 rupee kind of company in that sense. So somewhere, learning these things. So even for example, at stores, early on in stores itself, we started, we have a tech team in-house that likes to tinker with stuff. We try to understand walk-in data and try to understand, hey, how can we get in people, what's the information that's coming in? So our tech team kind of built this little small device that's tracking, it uses the same video camera that's there for security. It's also tracking, like, how do I say, Google Analytics for offline in that sense. It's tracking male, female, it's tracking approximate age, it's tracking if the person came in and converted. So that means if the person has walked out with a Chumbak bag, so the artificial intelligence is understanding what a Chumbak bag looks like, a shopping bag, and when that person leaves the store, that's the kind of stuff that we're doing there. So I think somewhere along the way, over investing in technology has really helped us as a startup, and that's something that I keep telling people that's something one should do. The other thing is, I think what we've learned along the way is that choice of metrics is as important as measurement. And while there are basic metrics such as it could be 50 of them which would be basic, but like revenue and sales and pricing and average stuff and all of that, I think some of the stuff that's important is we learned that work with the kind of metrics that are important to your own business. While we might have the basics which are covered in all of this, working with stuff that's extremely important to your own thing and the learnings that will come out and being able to affect your own businesses. And one of the other thing that we learned very early on as leadership and through the organization is learning to ignore vanity data as such. While the industry, or even, I'm hoping none of my investors are on this call, but even the kind of stuff that people ask for may not make sense to you, and stop reading into that kind of data and looking for that kind of data. So choice of metrics, keep it to yourself and keep it as short and crisp as possible in that sense. This I know Girish spoke about democratizing data and it's good and bad and stuff like that. And I think some of the stuff that we've learned is, while at a leadership level or even at an analytics team level and a data analytics team level, if you're keeping all this data hidden to yourself, right, I think you can't build a data culture. The very idea is that, hey, listen, your participants, and as important in both collection of data as well as reading this data. While we have a data analytics team that will help you and try and understand what this data is, it's extremely important that you feel as much as an owner as I do. So I think, and agree completely with Girish when he says top down and bottom up kind of approach in terms of making sure that data is extremely critical to the organization. and the kind of, pat on the back that you get, or the kick in the back that you get of having used or misused data in that sense. I think that's extremely important. It creates, I think, this entire democratization of data creates a whole bunch of transparency, honesty, and a whole bunch of interdepartmental trust, which is so important in companies as we scale. So democratization of data is like, it's extremely important. And at Chumbak, we've made sure that anyone who has access to data has it across, and it's open for everyone to see. Because what we've also learned is that relevant departments are like an outside eye looking into your kind of data, give you a whole bunch of learning that you, constantly having looked at it for months, may not have seen or might have missed in that sense. So democratization of data, I think, is a good thing. This again, I think, is something that we've learned the hard way, where I think it's extremely easy to fall into this trap, right? Of like, hey, wow, there's so much of data available. We even know the color purple, for example. And looking at these metrics and spending too much time and trying to understand this. I think the other thing is that making sure that you're not spending so much of time, like I keep giving example of playing a game of table tennis, right? If you look at the game of table tennis, maybe about 20% of the time is spent playing table tennis at home and wherever, and 80% of time is spent going and looking for that damn ball which is rolled off somewhere. So I think it kind of distracts you from the purpose of saying that, hey, listen, this is the kind of stuff that we have. Let's fix the metrics that make sense to us, and let's fix the metrics that we believe can move the needle on any part of the business in that sense. And the idea is to kind of continuously strive to shave off as much as of that data that we're getting through, such that we're, as I keep telling people, unless I see it in one Excel sheet, it's too much data for me. I mean, I don't want to scroll horizontally, vertically. I need to see it within one kind of page, so as to speak. And that's the kind of goal that we're getting to, and saying that too much data can kill you in that sense. So the other side of it is also that one sees so much of data, there's like this entire alarmist approach to, oh my God, this is happening, that's happening. And then you realize that damn data is actually, irrelevant to your life. So getting to that one pager is something that I think is our goal. We're maybe a little bit of a 20% scroll, but we're getting there in that sense. The other thing we've learned is data as part of performance appraisal in that sense. It's a silly thing, but I think it was important in our learning. Every single person at Chumbak, from their performance perspective, is appraised on a data point. There is no, what we've learned is that a lot of people in the marketing department, with the usage of their nice English and language and all, say that, I will do this and I will make the brand get known better, and or the design team will say I will do this. And what we realized is that putting in numbers into and saying that these are my expectations as your manager, and then going above that and saying these are my expectations as the founder of this company and who's leading this company, these are what my kind of key goals are, and saying that I will achieve A, B, C, D, E. How you do it is after that, but then it kind of helps people know that this is what is being looked at on a daily basis. Otherwise, we tend to, there's a lot of poetry without the prose. So I think that's kind of something that we've learned along the way. I think the last thing that we've learned, obviously, is the science is the data collection and the art is the data interpretation, right? I think it's so both are equally important. I mean, when we see data collection, trying to understand what kind of data you're collecting, where you're collecting it from, is as important as reading the data and interpreting the data. So our teams have also been built, and the structures of the organization have also been built, that we kind of put these two teams apart. But the moment it starts flowing into actual dashboards and stuff like that, they're one person. So that the kind of insight that you get is also known by that person who's actually got their hands dirty by getting into the as everybody calls it a data lake, but trying to understand what is the best that we can get out of this. So I think those are our key learnings that we've learned along the years. And thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Vivek. Vishal, that was, I'm sorry, I'm mixing up. Vivek, that was really insightful. And of course, we learned a lot about how you guys do it. And I do like the way you use the analogy of the table tennis game. So don't look for the ball that long that you kind of lose track of the game. So yes, overinvest in data, but know what to take from it. So with that, I'm going to, invite our moderator, Vishal Agarwal. I must say he's an absolutely enthusiastic moderator. And he's all set for the session. He does this for a living. So, it kind of comes to him very naturally. He has about 20 years of experience in technology, MarTech consulting, consumer strategy, and brand media deployment. He is currently heading MarTech solutioning for Merkle Socrati in India. And he's going to be the moderator for the panel discussion today. So Vishal, without much ado, let me hand it over to you.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you. It was great session. It was good to hear all the point of view from ZAVED to Vivek and Girish. We could quickly start with ZAVED. ZAVED, I looked at the deck, the way you have kind of put down 4 key pillars for the data-driven organization or the data culture, which starts with data at the center. You talked about the business impact the data does to people, and finally the tech implementation or the tech enablement. What I would want you to throw some light is what was Unilever's journey to being data culture? Like, if you could summarize that for us and give us some insights, we could kickstart the panel discussion with that.
Sure. I think I'll give a bit of history where we realized the importance of data. So what we did was a few years back, we adopted a strategy called winning strategy, which is called winning in many India, because we realized that you can't win in India just looking at India as one country. You need to really de-average the country, because our country is very different. Every kilometer you go in, things change. Now, what we also did internally, we realized, so we divided the country into 14 consumer clusters. At the same time, what we also did was we divided our business into 15 country category teams, business teams. So what we did was there was like 15 small equals, imagine, in the company. Now imagine 15 teams trying to figure out 14 consumer clusters. That need of really understanding consumers to that granularity was almost impossible. And in a situation where, and this is when I'm talking about 2015, 16, when it started, then you realize that there's the importance of really understanding consumers and customers at the granular level and able to really connect that. That is when we started our first program, and we had started a project which is Livewire. And I mentioned about that as well. That was one of our first experiments where we look at disparate data, connect those disparate data. So whether it is about retail feedback, consumer behavior, measures, financial data, media investment, and how do you really connect them together to really figure out where are the opportunities for the business. I think that's what sort of triggered in the business the importance of really understanding data and using data for consumer understanding. And sort of that's the journey, I would say, how we started.
Thank you, David. It really makes sense, from multiple clusters to building 15 different categories across the country, trying to understand the whole disparate data and mapping it back to the business. It makes sense. A quick question while we are at while we're talking about it, was there any enrichment of data in HUL, any strategy to enrich customer data which we had kind of taken care of? That's a question from Anjali.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. So what we do is there is actually a lot of data enrichment work that happens. So we work with different partners where we try to really enrich the data. In fact, what we also realize that, which is, I think both Girish and Vivek alluded as well, you'd be surprised the amount of data that we sit on the organization and how you can overlay the data. So I have got a Lakme salon data. I've got a promoter sitting in the store. I've got people that actually go home to home. For example, we go and sample in the tune of 100 million sampling that is done across India. So imagine the amount of data that we sit on. So internally, we are actually trying to do it. We're relevant because there are certain cases where you know at certain segments, we really need to partner where we collaborate with partners as well to enrich the data.
Sure. Sure, makes sense. Girish, moving to you, I think the way you really defined data culture, where you actually brought up the culture definition from dictionary, added data to it by calling it out data for business and a way of life was very, very interesting. I don't think so. We've looked at that lens for data culture. You talked about new age startups, and we'll come to Mr. Vivek, but you talked about companies who are 20-year-old doing humongous kind of work, especially Aditya Birla Capital, across different lines of businesses. You talked about while creative folks might call out saying, we are not data driven, and you gave examples of how they need to be data driven. Your point of view on top down to bottoms up was very, very interesting. What I would want you to throw some light while you talk about what is your definition of data culture, like if you could summarize that, and if you could add, like does a customer data platform helps or enables a company like Aditya Birla in driving the data culture? Like if you could stitch these two things. One is what according to you was the definition of data culture at Aditya Birla, and did you look up to a CDP or a DMP to solve the data-driven marketing problems?
So, Vishal, from a culture point of view, I think I've waxed eloquent on during my presentation, and I explained all of that came from my experience with AB Capital. And while that's the truth, I think let me give you an idea of how we went about, looking at frameworks or platforms. It's again, rather than being caught up with a technology platform, to build a data culture, I would rather, flip it the other way around and say, the data is, as Zaved was saying, that it's the refined fuel, right? It's at the bottom or the foundation. So how did we go about? If you have to come up with, let me use a term which is a management term, a framework, so to speak.
Yeah.
From a Birla Capital point of view, the starting point was very similar to what happened in HUL, which is to understand the needs of the customer, especially when you go to market as Aditya Birla Capital and not as as mutual funds or life insurance, because it's that same individual who wants to invest, who wants to cover his or her life, and so on. So we got to look at it from a customer's point of view, from the individual's point of view, and stitch together all the data around. Now, technically, you may call it a CDP and so on, but we would rather, start with defining, which are the customer journeys that really are important from the organization's point of view. Okay, you could have n number of customer journeys, and for that matter, we have a very large distributor network. There are also distributor journeys. So prioritize the key distributor and customer journeys, figure out which products work best, and lend themselves best to the current lot of customers, right? And prioritize that. Then it comes down to figuring out the technology, which is, should we have a CDP which brings together both internal CRM data and offline data, and brings in, digital data and from both first party, third party cookies and so on, and, blends them together. That's the technology part of it, right? And then that's a technology layer. It should be hosted on the cloud. In the case of BFSI, there's a big discussion on whether we're allowed to host on the cloud and what can we host on the cloud and so on. There's a layer of discussion happening there. And then, of course, there's a bottom layer on the foundation of data, right? And in the case of BFSI specifically, there's an overarching angle of compliance and regulation. So we are regulated by 4 regulators in our different lines of businesses. So, and we take it very seriously. And we have to be very careful about who gets to see what data, what level of data, and so on. So there is a whole regulatory aspect to it. So if I have to kind of phrase the entire put the entire framework into perspective, it's the journeys, the products, the technology, the underlying data that is required to drive this stack up, and then have a complete overview. Let the folks in compliance and legal cut right across all these slices to ensure that everything is kosher from a regulation point of view. So that's the way we would, I would recommend any organization go about, setting up a framework in which the CDP or the technology stack is one of the layers. That's the way I would rather put it.
Very, very well said, Girish. The way you said it, that you start with the customer journey, you look at different products or lines of businesses, put data at the center, and then build a framework where regulatory or all the regulatory laws, GDPRs cut across, and we have access to data, can define whether we go a CDP route, whether a tech route. Makes sense. Moving to Vivek. Vivek, when I looked at your presentation, I kind of got reminded with that book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and you put 8 habits of highly effective marketers to go the data culture. It was very, very interesting to just put 8 bullet points, talk about how you think what is data culture. If you could summarize and define for a startup, which is a new age startup in retail space, what is your definition, and what do you think is your journey for on that data driven organization to build data culture?
I think my key takeaway from this entire thing, in terms of having tried to build this entire data culture at Chumbak, I think one of the key things is that it has to be something that, while we both agree, Girish and I said that top down, bottom down, it has to start top down. It has to say, hey, listen, this is extremely important enough for the entire company, and set those ground rules saying that, this is the kind of culture that we're building, and slowly then build upon that, and then bring people under your wing and say, hey, this is what we're doing, and stuff like that. I think that's our biggest learning, saying that unless, you may provide all the tools in the world and all the data in the world, and unless you're looking at it and making decisions, unless, that's not there, it's not going to go anywhere. And that's been my biggest learning in terms of trying to create a data culture.
Understood. We were taking the cue from what we were speaking to Girish. There was a question on the group by Kshitij for customer data, and I tried to cue it to Girish. For a large organization, he gave his point of view. What do you think could be your point of view for a startup? Would a startup pick up customer data platform? How would you look at an ROI from a tech platform if you're trying to drive marketing strategies?
I think definitely look at these platforms, and to me, honestly, as I said, if I'm a big believer in over investing in technology, right? And I think ROI is like dur ki baat hai kind of thing. I think the kind of tangible return on investment kind of numbers that are there are difficult to say in some cases, right? And saying that, hey, I spent X amount of money, am I going to get? You can't look at data and analysis like that. You've got to look at it and like, listen, it's a part and parcel of everyday culture. Unless I'm going to say that, hey, listen, I'm going to spend 100 rupees on, Facebook, I need 400 rupees or 500 rupees back in revenue. It's not as clean cut as that. There are a lot of stuff that, data that we get in from customer feedback, which is really, hey, why don't you keep your store open from this time to this time? Why don't you do this? Why don't you? And that gets translated into like an action point. But there is no ROI. It's just like making that customer happier. Eventually there's an ROI, but I don't think that's something that we track in that sense.
Sure. Makes sense. It sounds very much from a paradigm or a lens of a startup founder. The way you looked at it made sense.
I can see Girish and ZAVED cringing and saying that, why doesn't this happen here?
So,
for analytics.
ZAVED, from the ROI of investment in tech to talking about data culture, one of the key pointers you had in your 4 or 5 steps was business impact. If you could call out what is that you were trying to drive, or what are the key KPIs or outcomes you have measured when you went and you crossed the bridge of being a data-driven organization and driving data culture?
To be honest, it's not very easy. And the way Vivek is saying, just to do the ROI and how you do it. And it's not easy, not because you can't figure out ROI. You might have all the capability in the world, but as Girish has said, people are not adopting. Then you sit on the data and you're not using it. You'll realize that your ROI won't come. But I'll tell you, especially for legacy organization like ours, one of the biggest thing is that if you're able to really either impact growth or profitability, that triggers people, because we sort of get our adrenaline rush because we want to grow businesses. So it's then the business has been sitting there. And when we actually tell them that, listen, if a data is getting unlocked and we're able to create impact, that's when people really get. So let me give an example of a very small data example, that figuring out the temperature and the sound of my boilers enables me to figure out that if I have to do preventive maintenance or not. Sure. Because if I really do a preventive maintenance of the boiler, my downtime will be far less. So my production actually will get better fulfilled for that. So for an engineer at the shop floor, that small data is critical. But if I just tell them that, listen, you pick up this temperature and the sound of the boiler, he will say it's useless. But if I tell him that, listen, because you've applied it, and now you will be able to do a preventive maintenance rather than a full line shutdown, you suddenly realize the value of data. So it is not necessarily going in that way, but we need to really show what is the direct impact of the data that we're going to do. For every dollar that you're going to spend on e-commerce, how do you really make sure? A lot of times, and we still are equally end up spending a lot of money, and we're learning that as well. A lot of work happens on the upper funnel. But upper funnel is great. I always tell them it's a luxury to be able to pay upper funnel, but if it doesn't convert into add to cart and sales, then so generally it is a social service that we're doing, isn't it? So at the end of the day, we need to figure out a link and become better. In fact, I have huge compliments for the startup team and startup co-founders like Vivek, because they actually use it much better than we have so much to learn from them.
Sure. Makes sense. So, Girish, if you look at, we've been talking about ROI to business impact. You talked about technology, implementation of technology, Girish, and specifically for an org, which is BFSI, it is harder to implement tech across lines of businesses. There could be challenges of how we're using customer data across different lines of business. How are we going to store the data? What have been your key challenges, or what have been your key frameworks to set up new age tech? Like, is it like the way I would want to look at it is probably setting up a data warehouse at Chumbak could be much easier, and using the data for cross-selling upsell could be much easier, while setting up a CDP or a data warehouse at Aditya Birla Group with lines of businesses of PIFA, where we want to kind of use the same customer base, it is very, very hard. So what have been your path and what have been your ways to solve that problem?
I mean, you're absolutely right. You can imagine 13 lines of businesses, 4 regulators, and the kind of challenges we would have faced in getting the data in, and the fact that the data had to also be Chinese walled, right? So you can't have data hopping across.
Correct.
So yeah, definitely. I'm sure Chumbak would have had its own, a series of challenges, and Vivek's face says it all. But yes, we're talking about, millions data of transactional data of millions of customers. We're talking about, in just one business, we'd have 400 million transactions. Okay, so the volumes are phenomenally high. So it's a problem of scale. There was that, but there was also the whole challenge of managing regulation and ensure that data does not, there's no osmosis happening between the lines of businesses. Despite that, we still have to run programs like cross-sell, right? So, and that's the reason why we had to really figure out what is right from a regulation point of view. How can we anonymize data? So how do we build models based on anonymous data and based on segmented data, as against getting down into transactional level and getting contact information and so on. So you got to build models in a different way. So it's too short a session to elaborate on, but yes, you're absolutely right. It's a really tough part, which is model building for when from an analytical point of view. When you're building models that cut across lines of businesses is a different ballgame. And storage of data itself is a challenge in itself. Then it comes down to the whole question of us getting consent from the customer, that we can have, they can be reached out to, and we have to work within the limits of which customer has given us consent to do what. So these are the guardrails around which we had to operate, and we had to so it's not just an operation. These are not operational guardrails. These guardrails had to be percolated right down to the data warehouse architecture.
Understood.
So
Understood.
that's the real challenge. We got to get the folks in IT to actually set up the data architecture and the data hosting, which is in line with the entire operational ethos that comes in from a regulation point of view and from a business point of view, which is why when I explained the framework that we spoke of, we had regulation cutting right across all verticals. It's only then that the structure at the IT level and the data warehouse level will match the expectations of the business. So it's not an easy task to line up 13 data from 13 lines of business. Which data can be ingested? There's also accessibility of data. There are certain kinds of data that can't be accessed and brought into the warehouse, whereas certain data can be brought in. So and what we did was to actually, if I may take another 10 seconds, we went about what we called a data discovery exercise across all our lines of businesses. And we traced every journey, and at every step of the journey, what data gets generated and what data gets created and destroyed, so to speak, inflow and outflow of data. It was a humongous exercise that we did. And that was the ground, served as the template for us to build our entire data warehouse. So I think
to summarize,
that data discovery exercise is very important.
Yeah, to summarize, what you're saying is the data discovery exercise across all the 13 lines of businesses, setting up a data warehouse where one of the bigger challenges, how do we kind of harvest data and store data with Chinese walls, building models and across lines of business while we get the right consent. And finally, the way I was looking at it is the segmentation of cohorts which are built once we anonymize the data. Makes sense. Vivek, while we were talking to Girish, he talked about his challenges. Principally, I felt that a co-founder and a new age startup would not have data challenges, and they would be data driven. They would be designed to be data driven on day one. Do you think there are challenges with the digital startups who are like tech savvy? The whole team is tech savvy. What would be your 2 cents on what are your challenges and what are the challenges a startup would have to become data driven?
I think the number one challenge that we faced was people trying to get everybody on board and saying that, hey, data is as important as Vivek says it is. I mean, my word may mean nothing to a designer sitting somewhere or someone in the warehouse or someone at the store. Why is it important to get this data, or why is it important to act on this data? I think the number one challenge was getting people on the same page. And I think that's taken a couple of years, but I think slowly people have kind of understood, saying that, we used to do literally, like with the core team, I've done a daily call for the last 5 years saying that, hey, listen, now just show me that one sheet. And then I think then it percolates down, in that sense. So it's in top down, while it's given equal importance as bottom up, it's a little bit more, maybe 60-40 in that sense in my mind. But I think looking at it every single day and saying that's the only thing that I'm going to look at, and then my decisions are only going to be based on that one pager. So I think the biggest challenge is getting people on board.
Sure. So when you're saying getting people on board, there was also a question out there saying, is there a role for a data culturist? So would you say there is a role for a data champion or a data culturist? And how would you define that role? Yeah.
Me.
That's me.
I'm the data culturist.
Okay.
But I think honestly, it needs to be, that can be top down level. I can't speak for Zaved and Girish's size of their companies. I'm sure you can have a person. I think that question is them. At a startup level, it's me. It's clearly me saying that I'm this evangelist saying that, guys, data is the most important thing in our lives. So I'm not sure about.
Zaved, how would you look at Unilever and building a role for a data culturist?
So whether you call it data culturist or not, we have got a chief data officer who's part of the leadership team. And in fact, he works closely with me as well. And not only he's the data evangelist in the organization, he's also the transformation agent as well. So he also co-leads with me the change as well, because it is very important. And Girish alluded to it. You will get a lot of data. The biggest challenge is how do you really get people to adopt and use the data? Because, whenever you're trying to really drive this in an organization, Vivek also spoke about it, the differences between a data-led objective assessment versus a subjective inference. Because what tends to happen is people will always react based on own perception, despite the fact that what data has done. I can tell you, we have a machine decision support system which is backed by data, and which is backed by their own category data. When I'm telling them that, listen, you will actually have this amount of elasticity, they say, no, it's wrong. But I'm saying, how can it be wrong? Because it is used your data. It is not my data that it has used.
Sure.
But because the person is actually impacted, and that's a human behavior, that you are impacted by recency. And hence you'll always take your decision based on recency. You don't really look at your total data set. So there is actually an importance to bring out someone that enables you to really almost be the pole bearer of this transformation.
Sure. So Vivek, coming back to you, while you say that you are the data champion, you're the guy, that brings us to an idea that it's a top-down approach where a founder at a startup is pushing for it, while Girish had a point of view that it needs to be top-down and bottoms up. What's your point of view? Like, how do you make sure that guys who are joining new?
I think it starts top-down. I think, people, at middle management may come up with the best ideas. Unless someone's listening to them on the top and making decisions on that, it's not going to work. So I think the push has to start, but then it's like this, data is like this ever-changing, animal that you have to keep feeding, and it's literally everybody's baby, and it has to start from the top.
Got it. There is one question, Zaved, for you. It says that how did data help the crisis of 2019 Holi ad? And how did you decide on what should or could be the right storyline for the Holi films of the future?
Well, very interesting question. On the 2019 Holi ad, I know that created a lot of controversy. We were actually following, and I'll tell you how we looked at it. We looked at the impact of it. The impact was very important, because if you look at the messages that we were spreading, had nothing to do. It was a very cultural, relevant message that we spread. Obviously, there are, and you'll always have, when you have communication, different people with different points of view. I think the question being that we were monitoring the sentiment, we were monitoring the, and it automatically has died down. I mean, we learned, obviously, we always learn from it, and based on it, you take your communication. You also need to read the data, because the other sense of data is there are also outliers. There's a lot of noise in data. So you need to figure out, especially in our sort of organization where we're actually marketing to the masses. But during the 19, I know because we were closely monitoring to understand the sentiments, and we did have a huge work around sentiment to figure out the impact that it had. While there was a lot more news about any of the conversation, there's actually a lot more positivity around as well.
Sure. Makes sense. This also calls out, I think Mr. Girish pointed out that while there are a few creative guys who would stand up and say that probably we are not data driven, this specific query on the Holi ad, and that we are managing, monitoring the sentiments and kind of queuing it for our future creatives makes sense with what Girish was also talking, that irrespective of the lines of businesses, irrespective of the function, whether within the marketing it's creative, data becomes at the center, and we have to keep monitoring what's happening outside our ecosystem.
Oh, absolutely. Because unless you're able to really connect them together, and Girish was alluding to the same thing as well, because that's when the power of data gets unleashed. Huh? So it's not just within my marketing silo, I look at data, and alluded, there are people who sort of almost think it's their proprietary to sit on that piece of data, and we have crossed that as well. To unleash and really, and Vivek talked about democratizing as well, because that's when you really see the power of data get unleashed.
Sure, makes sense. Girish, any closing remarks from you as takeaway for being a data-driven organization?
I think one thing that we should be thinking about and looking at is the impact that AI is going to have in the organizations, going forward. And I'll just allude to the point that, you kind of quoted one of my points, which is on the fact that, typically the folks who are creative, they don't see the need of data in their lives, because it's they would probably consider their roles as more the heart than the brain. But there is that, and then you have customer service, right?
Yep.
Where it's again considered a more a heart job than a brain job. The two examples that I can give you. And the rate at which AI is really taking on. I mean, you just look at GPT-3 and what it's doing. It's just phenomenal, and a lot of the heart is actually moving into the brain, and and the nuance of conversational the nuances of conversation is also getting into the way AI bots talk and react, and we are doing some work in that space also. So that aspect of managing the organization's culture, when they see these things happen, when they see AI and its and the impact it could have on the heart roles, and then we'll start seeing them expand. GPT, they can write code. I mean, imagine if you're in an IT company and you suddenly start having a an AI module that is going to write code. How do you deal with that, right? So how do you work out your organization's culture with respect to AI is something which I think it's something which I didn't touch upon, at least when I spoke about, but it's an aspect I think we should all be wary of from a human cultural point of view, from an employee cultural point of view.
Thank you, Girish. Monica, I have not seen the polls, the outcomes of the poll.
Let me actually, we've not launched it because we were waiting for the discussion to get over, but I'll quickly launch it. And if till then you want to sum up, you could, and then we'll take the results.
Sure. So it was a very interesting session. We looked at how a large BFSI organization like Aditya Birla Group is looking at being data driven. Girish summed it up with saying that AI, the next gen technology, implementing that is very, very critical. The way Vivek kind of organized his data driven approach of the 8 different strategies, and his point of view that the top down approach, that there is a guy sitting at the top who's pushing for making sure that we are making decisions. And in fact, his last point, or his last 8th strategy, was even the appraisals are data driven, and there is a clear key KPIs which are bound to each of the employees for the appraisals. Really made sense. And the way Javed kind of put 4 steps which had people and data at the core, data literacy, data democratization, and finally embracing the tech, was key outcomes of how we could become data driven. I think that's the way we look at it. So if as marketeers, as technologists, when we're going to run our own decisions, it's important to look at those 4 steps, which is putting data at the center, looking at training the people, building the right org structure, using technology, and then having the right business impacts for each of the data-driven decisions which we are trying to build. I think that's the way I would want to summarize the whole conversation and the panel. And Monica, if you're ready, we could look at if there are outcomes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll share the poll results and then I'll take over.
Sure. So the first question on the poll was how important it is for us to define business goals, which are going to actually lead for us to become data-driven org and build data culture. 87% of the poll says it's above 8 in a scale of 1 to 10, above 8. Very, very, so we all agree that is a very important point. I think Javed, Vivek, all of us had that one key pointer, which is the business outcome, and how are we defining the business outcome. So that, Monica, did we had any other poll, or that's it?
No, that's it. In the interest of time, we're not doing more polls, but so I must say that this was an absolutely insightful session. What made it most interesting is we had a point of view from a legacy organization. We had a point of view from a data regulated organization where regulation is very, very integral to all data usage that companies like Aditya Birla Capital do. And then we had a view from a new age organization and a startup, which again brought in a lot of progressive way of looking at data decisions and data culture, which made it extremely comprehensive. And with Vishal, your expertise, we were really able to decode and understand all of it collectively. So it was extremely fruitful. I must say the audience was very interactive. We've had crazy amount of questions. We've also had questions on the streams that are live. So we may send it across individually to the speakers to answer it. I clearly see a need for a sequel because there's still a lot more people who want to understand. But in the interest of time, we're going to close the session. I want to say a big thank you to all of you. Really appreciate all the understanding you have shared. It's going to be extremely useful. And I'd also like to let the audience know that do log in to our upcoming webinar, which is going to be focused on understanding e-commerce in mature markets like China, Southeast Asia, US, and a view on India. Again, another interesting session which you must attend. We also have our annual marquee event, MMA Impact India, coming up, which is on the 20th and 21st of May, where we'll be unveiling a couple of industry playbooks as well. So do not miss it and do register for it. The QR codes are flashing on your screen for you to sort of register right away and block your calendars. So whilst I'll see you soon, do stay in touch with us through our social media handles, visit our website, and keep chewing on to the insights we have to share for you to be able to travel the journey of modern marketing. So have a lovely evening, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.